Okay, so we can get started, and I hope all the participants joining are able to hear me loud and clear. So good afternoon, everybody. This is Sam van den Plas. I'm Policy Director at Carbon Market Watch, and delighted to host this event discussing why an ETS is needed to make road transport fit for 55. We're discussing this against the backdrop of a whole Fit for 55 package, basically updating Europe's climate and energy targets by 2030. And one of the key components proposed there by the European Commission is an emissions trading system for road transport and buildings. This is a separate system, separate from the current European emissions trading system, but it functions, let's say, next to it. Covering basically the emissions from road transport and buildings and almost doubling the current coverage of the EU ETS. It's a compliance obligation to fuel suppliers. Monitoring, reporting requirements would start in 2024, and the actual compliance obligations having to surrender allowances in 2026. So this is what we're looking at, and it's clearly a major political and an economic challenge due to the high price uncertainty, especially in light of the current energy price crunch we are seeing on the markets and leading to social and economic impacts. So it makes the current political discussions and finding agreement on this challenging. That's clear from several amendments which have already been proposed in the European Parliament to, for example, completely delete the existence of this ETS for road transport and buildings. And this is what we will be discussing today. We hope to clarify why carbon pricing is needed to decarbonize not only the road transport sector, also the building sector, but we will focus on road transport here specifically, and how it can be implemented, balancing political concerns with economic and also environmental necessities. So without further ado, I'll make one big introduction round for all our presenters and panelists gathered here today, and thank you very much all for joining us. Then I'll go into some of the practicalities, housekeeping rules, and then we'll move on immediately. So I'm joined here this afternoon by an excellent set of distinguished speakers. Professor Ottmar Edenhofer, he's director of the Potsdam Institute for Global Climate Impact Research, the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, and he's also professor for climate economics and public policy at the Berlin Institute for Technology. Also joining from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research is Dr. Michael Pahle. He's head of the working group Climate and Energy Policy there. Then Mr. Thomas Fabian, he's director commercial vehicles at ACEA, which is the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. Ms. Sophie Defour is climate manager at TNE, Transport and Environment, based in Brussels, representing NGOs here today. And then Dr. Peter Liese, he is member of the European Parliament and for the EPP group, the coordinator in the Committee on Environment, Public Health and Food Safety. Of course, Dr. Liese is also the rapporteur for the review of the EU ETS directive, and therefore not the only one, but he's at least definitely holding a significant part of the pen of the proposal going through the European Parliament. For the panel discussion, we will also be joined by Ms. Nicolette van der Jacht. She is Director General of the European Organization of Logistics Service Providers and Freight Forwarders. So with that, a couple of housekeeping rules. We have, at least the audience has a chat function available. The speakers and the panelists will not read any messages there, but you feel free to interact, communicate between yourself. If you do want to ask some questions to the panel, and at the very end, we'll open it up for some questions and answers. A link will be shared through Slido. and you can type in your questions there. You can also upvote questions which others ask, and we will do our best to address at least some of those towards the end of the session, which is foreseen at 6 o'clock Brussels time this afternoon. So with that, without further ado, I will hand over to the colleagues from Potsdam Institute, Professor Edenhofer, Dr. Pahle. I believe you both will share this presentation, basically focusing on the buildings and road transport ETS in times of an energy crisis, in times of a war going on in Ukraine. Why do we need to agree on it for the future now more than ever is the title of the presentation. So Professor Edenhofer, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. So can you hear me and can you see my slides?
Yes, all is clear.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to share with you a few thoughts on the second ETS for building, road, and transport. Now, I have two propositions which I would like to justify in the next 15 minutes. The first one is that this second ETS has a potential to combine energy security and climate policy. And in times of war, this seems to me is a very important aspect, which hasn't been discussed too much. And here I would like to explore the implications, the geopolitical implications of the Green Deal in general, in particular on this second ETS. And the second claim, which I would like to justify in my talk, is here that we need this ETS on building, road, and transport, because to ensure that the future energy prices are going into the right direction. Otherwise, we are at risk that we make wrong and unfortunate decisions, in particular for our energy investment. So let me start with my first claim, the combination of energy security and climate policy. And my starting point is here, the price trajectory. What you can see here is the development of the oil price, the coal price, natural gas price, and the electricity price. And let me share a few observations, and then I try to explore the implications. First of all, what you can see is that we have seen a sharp increase of the natural gas price. And by the way, this cannot be seen here, but econometric studies clearly show that the increase of the gas prices is the most important driver of the inflation in Europe. So the second observation here is that the gas price has a higher growth than the coal price. I will come back to that because this is very important to explore the implications for climate policy of the aggressive war in the Ukraine. And of course, you can see also the oil price. And so people start to speculate what will be the future development of the oil price. And I will come back to that later. And let me explore the implications of this price trajectory. And I could highlight here what we can see is here the power of the relative prices. One first and almost a very interesting observation made by Bruegel was that we see and can observe that there are substantial revenues for Russia from selling oil and gas to the EU. And this is driven by this increase of the oil and the gas price. And there's no doubt that we are financing to a certain extent Russia's war machine. And the aid which Europe provides to the Ukraine is only just a fraction of what compare to the revenues for Russia. So this is a political ramification of the war in the Ukraine. However, this is not the only one. So let me highlight one important aspect. I told you that we can observe in our price trajectory that the coal price has a lower growth rate than the gas price. And this has globally a very, very important implication. Globally, it has the implication that we see a continuation of the coal renaissance, in particular in Asia. In Asia, coal comes back into the power sector and into the power market. So before the war, there was also a renaissance of coal. The most recent IPCC report has highlighted this particular aspect. In Europe, we might be in a much more fortunate situation. Why? Because we have ETS1, which consists of the power sector and of the industry sector. Here we have a cap, and it might be the case that coal comes back, but this does not imply that the emissions will increase because of the cap. In other sectors of the industry, emissions has to be reduced. Now, the only thing what has to happen in the future is that the Commission has to steadfast and also then to sharpen the linear reduction factor. But the implication of the Green Deal is not only in the coal sector. The ETS1, the ETS, the EU ETS, and the ETS for building, road, and transport implicitly form a demand cartel, in particular on oil and the gas market. And here I would like to highlight the implication on the oil and the gas market, because this is really very, very important. Because the Green Deal has a very important implication that even before 2030, we will see a sharp decline in the demand of oil and gas, and as an implication, a sharp decline of the volume of the imports of oil and gas. This has also an implication for Russia, and in particular for the intertemporal budget constraint. And if you are not an economist, so you shouldn't be afraid about this term intertemporal budget constraint. It simply means that for Russia, it is important to understand what are the future revenues from the oil and the gas imports. And this picture clearly shows that the future oil revenues and the future gas revenues will decline as long as and to the extent the European Green Deal will be implemented, and to the extent that we have these two emission trading schemes, on the one hand for the industry and the power sector, and on the other hand for building, road, and transport. The Green Deal tightens this intertemporal budget constraint of Russia for a sufficiently low creditworthiness. So there might be the case, and some people speculate about this, that Russia might be able to contract credits on the international capital market. But due to the fact that even in the future, the revenues will decline, it is very unlikely that the creditworthiness will remain at the same level as it is today. And therefore, the duration of war depends on this intertemporal budget constraint and not on the static one. And this is very important to understand. And this is the geopolitical implication of the European Green Deal, because it has an impact on the intertemporal budget constraint of all oil and gas exporters and for all oil and gas imports. But it can have a particular impact on the Russian oil and gas imports when Europe is in a position to change the composition of imports. So this picture shows that the Green Deal changes the volume, but now we have to ask the question, can we change the composition of these imports? And indeed, this is the case. We can do this. Taxing Russian imports reduces its resource rents. The degree to which the latter are reduced depends on the elasticities of supply. In plain language, it means it depends to what extent Russia has to sell their exports to Europe. And in the short term, it seems to me this is the case. And if Russia cannot respond to the tax by decreasing the price of oil and gas to a level below or equal to that of its competitors, there will be a relative price effect. And this hinges on the fiscal and technological constraints. So what we can say is that it is very likely that will be such a relative price effect, and this leads to a change of the composition of the imports. And therefore, the implication is this helps to reduce EU's dependency on Russian oil and gas, and thereby boosting energy security. Admittedly, this component is not yet implemented at the European scale, but there are also positive geopolitical side effects of such a policy. First of all, this kind of taxing imports serve as a flexible response. The tax level can be adjusted to concessions by Russia, and the tax revenues can go to a trust fund to help to rebuild the Ukraine or make mobility affordable. So when the gas prices are increasing and poor households has to be compensated. And taxing imports can improve the EU and Ukraine's relative bargaining power vis-a-vis Russia. So how could we implement such an idea in the second ETS for building, road and transport? Energy security and threats to peace will remain virulent as the result of the war in the Ukraine. But the second ETS, I always use the term the second ETS, but I mean the BRT ETS, is a suitable tool for combining energy security and climate policy. So what we have to implement, or we could implement, is a kind of an insecurity tax on imported energy on top of the carbon price. The aim is that taxing fossil fuel rents, depending on exporters' climate and peace commitments, and the lower the commitment, the higher the insecurity tax. So this can be easily implemented and combined with the second ETS. Now let me come to my second proposition to ensure the energy prices are going into the right direction. So there's a common belief now on the market that the oil prices will go up and the electricity prices will go down. So there are at least some speculation about this. And indeed, this could be the case. And this common belief has a quite important implication that some people argue that under the current prices, the second ETS might be redundant. As long as the oil prices are at a very high level, the internal combustion engine is relatively costly, even more so when the price rise further. And if the electricity prices might fall, so then there's a competitiveness of zero emissions vehicles. There would be the competitiveness would be increased when the electricity prices are also high. So such beliefs about the future prices might imply that the second ETS, the BRT ETS, is not needed. But the question is this well founded? Again, this argument depends on the belief that we have increasing oil prices and we have declining electricity prices. So then the international, in particular the oil market, would solve the problem for us. However, it seems to me this type of price forecasts and this kind of expectations are not very well founded. The current oil price inflated by war, well above projections for 2030, and there's a likelihood that they could fall again. And when the oil prices will fall again, and the electricity prices will be increased in the next few years, and we have reasons from our modeling to believe that electricity prices will increase because the transformation process implies for the transformation process increasing electricity prices. So then the emissions, in particular in the transport sector, will increase. And the implication is that the second ETS, the ETS for building, road and transport, is by no means redundant. So why do we need this second ETS? It is needed to ensure that the oil price remain at a high level at the long term, because when the oil prices will go down, the CO2 prices has to do the job to drive the prices into the right direction. And the ETS, the BRT ETS, is needed to ensure a regulatory level playing field. In particular, electricity is already regulated under the EU ETS, and therefore, we need an ETS which has the capability to respond to the fluctuation of the prices at the oil and in particular at the gas market. So therefore, in essence, we need the BRT ETS that the energy prices go into the right direction and also to respond to the fluctuations at the oil and at the gas market. Of course, this comes with a price. Compensation is needed, and this is a quite complicated figure, but it clearly shows, and I would like to ask you to look at the red line. These are the energy prices which are not compensated. So this is a study which we have done for the German government, where we have not just taken into account the CO2 prices, but in particular the gas prices. And this clearly shows that without the compensation, the poorest 10% of the households have to pay an overproportional burden. And this is, of course, not perceived as fair, and this is a real threat to the social cohesion. However, and this is important to understand, these compensation measures are now underway, at least in some of our member states, and these compensation measures are needed. They are also needed if we would have non-market-based instruments. Also, these non-market-based instruments like these technology standards incur costs, and they can be even more regressive than the price instrument in the carbon prices. And the potential of carbon pricing, and in particular, the potential of the BRT ETS to generate revenues, allows to get a fair distribution of burden, in particular for the poorest households. So this is something which I would like to share with you. And in essence, and this is my conclusion, the BRT ETS has the potential to combine energy security and climate policy. And in times of war, this seems to me is absolutely essential. And the BRT ETS can ensure that future energy prices are going into the right direction to send the right signal. This right signal can come with an unfair distribution of burden between the poor and the rich households. However, this problem can be addressed via a reasonable compensation scheme, and the BRT ETS allows to raise the revenues to address this important issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Edenhofer. I'll immediately hand over to Dr. Pala to complement that with a couple of additional slides, or at least some statements.
There's not actually much to say since we prepared the slides together, but I really want to emphasize the necessity to address how current expectation about future prices may evolve. Because I think this is something that has been really put upside down, and we know from a lot of studies and from experience that people tend to extrapolate or tend to make price projections based on current price levels. And I think this is really has put things upside down. And if you contrast it with fundamental modeling, so you would really expect things to develop differently. And this might create the notion that, especially in the current situation, that we do not need it. And so I think it's very important to emphasize that we should expect and prepare for energy prices going in the direction that we do not expect. And then this is really here from an economic point in terms of creating the right incentives, but also the right expectations for households in terms of investment. We need to get things straight.
Thank you very much. That's a very clear message that in times of geopolitical turmoil and energy insecurity, in fact, this underscores the usefulness for having this pricing system in place. So that's all very clear. Why it is needed, that question has been largely answered. But we will have to move to how can it be implemented, and for that I look forward to the next discussants coming in to have a bit more of the sectoral perspective, and I'll hand over to Thomas Fabian first, to give some perspectives coming from the road transport sector. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can see my screen and hear me well. First, thanks very much for the opportunity to present ACEA's perspective on carbon pricing and road transport. As you said at the beginning, ACEA represents the European manufacturers of the whole range of light and heavy-duty vehicles. That means cars, vans, but also trucks and buses. In my remarks today, I would like to focus specifically on the views of the commercial vehicle industry, but with a few nuances, they're equally applicable to the other vehicle segments too. So to start, first, the automotive industry is obviously committed to doing its part to limit greenhouse gas emissions and to reach climate neutrality by 2050 at the latest. About 2 years ago, so we started a regular exchange with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research to develop a joint understanding of what needs to be done to decarbonize one of the hard-to-abate sectors, and that is road transport, and specifically heavy-duty transport and logistics. And one of the early conclusions of this dialogue was that if we want to reach climate neutrality by 2050, essentially all new heavy-duty vehicles will have to be fossil-free from 2040. So the ambition and the challenge is actually a lot greater than the target date 2050 might imply. And there is definitely a high level of urgency, and it is well understood. The term fossil-free, by the way, was quite a deliberate choice, but more on that in a minute. Now, setting a target is important, but it's obviously not enough. And we also need to find a way to get there. And the way to get there for road transport comprises 3 interdependent building blocks, which must be in place simultaneously. And these building blocks are functional, reliable, and efficient vehicles, a sufficiently dense network of charging and refueling infrastructure that is suitable for all the different vehicle segments, and equally important, a coherent policy framework which enables and drives this transition away from the fossil-based options to the new alternatives. Now, when it comes to, on the first one, the low and especially zero-emission vehicles are clearly our responsibility as vehicle manufacturers. And they are becoming available across all segments, across many ranges, and many, many use cases. There are 2 main zero-emission powertrain technologies that we are convinced will soon become the backbone of road transport, and that is battery electric and hydrogen-powered vehicles. The offerings are clearly plentiful and diverse in the light-duty segment, and they're also in the heavy-duty segment. Zero-emission vehicles are becoming available rapidly. What is largely missing, especially for trucks, is a suitable charging and refueling infrastructure. And that is one of the key building blocks, but it's not in the focus today here. In order to decarbonize road transport, especially commercial transport, we basically need to make sure that zero-emission vehicles actually become the best choice, the best option, and the preferred choice of our customers, transport operators. First and foremost, the best choice from a commercial point of view, because the total costs of ownership, the TCOs, are what matters for them. They operate these vehicles as part of, or rather, they operate them to enable them to run their businesses of transporting goods and people. We need the vehicles, we need infrastructure, and not the least, we need a policy framework that actually makes them want the new powertrain vehicles, because operating them makes commercially more sense than relying on the conventional alternatives. And this is where carbon pricing comes in, as it has a crucial role in the policy framework. It is, in our view, it is imperative that carbon emissions are associated with their true costs, and that these are factored in when transport operators make their investment decisions. The proposal to establish an emission trading system for road transport fuels, in our view, does exactly this. And that is why we're so clearly in favor of it. And mind you, perhaps it should indeed be called ETS for road transport fuels, because that's what it's about, the fuels. Now, from our point of view, the ETS is a means to an end that facilitates the decarbonization of road transport. It is one It is one crucial, but it's only one part of a wider policy framework. It is not a silver bullet. That means, at least for the foreseeable future, it will not and cannot replace other regulations. As always in the real world, where compromise rules, we do not expect one single instrument alone to set the right pricing signals. That is why we believe that emission standards, for example, will also have to have their place in the regulatory framework. And the same should apply for other regulations, such as the Eurovignette, for example, or CO2-based differentiation of road user charges, as well as energy taxation or the Renewable Energy Directive. Especially the latter one also plays an important role in making sure that the low carbon and renewable energy carriers, that means electricity, hydrogen, and the renewable fuels, become available in time and in the quantities needed. And just to come back to my earlier remark on fuels and the ambition to go fossil-free, despite the focus of vehicle manufacturers on zero-emission vehicles, it is hard to see that transport operators can and will switch fast enough to these vehicles in time to bring the emissions down as fast as needed. So that means low carbon and renewable fuels will have to play a rapidly increasing role in the decarbonization, despite the declining market share of the internal combustion engine across all segments. And this is again where a solid carbon pricing system is needed to send the right signals to rapidly phase out fossil fuels and energy carriers. It is obviously important to carefully balance the impact the ETS will have on those immediately affected by it. That means road users. The sector must be enabled to absorb and adjust to the new settings, but it is equally important also to maintain the price signals, not weaken or offset them. Only if fossil fuels are eventually priced appropriately, and that means they become more expensive than the fossil-free alternatives, will those alternatives actually take off. And once they do, it will happen fast, we're convinced. Another point to recognize is that the ETS is an instrument to share the economic costs of the transition to climate neutrality across the value chain. This transition does not come for free, and its costs cannot be borne by one part of the value chain alone, be it vehicle manufacturers or be it transport operators, component suppliers, or any other part in transport and logistics. That means higher fossil fuels and higher fossil fuel costs must and will eventually become visible in the higher costs for shippers and the industries that rely on the transports. Their role on the demand side can be and is a driving factor. But let me reiterate here also that higher costs for customers and operators, for example, via the ETS2, may be acceptable and also needed to encourage a move away from fossil fuels. But it will not be acceptable if customers and operators only see the rising costs for transport without having widespread access to appropriately priced low carbon alternatives. The last point here, as a means to an end in itself, vehicles will not be the bottleneck of this transition, but their market uptake obviously heavily relies on a coherent and effective enabling framework being in place. Now, when it comes to the ETS proposal at hand that is currently on the table of policymakers, a few recommendations here. Revenues, in our view, should be ring-fenced and reinvested in the road sector. They should be used to decarbonize the sector and ensure that the alternatives that help users avoid the higher costs do become available and in time and in the necessary quantities. There are plenty of options how to spend the revenues, but in our view, this is obviously a crucial factor that will determine its success or failure. Measures that have been established, second point here, measures that have been established on national levels, if you want the early movers, national ETS systems are welcome, but it is important to avoid fragmentation and market distortions between member states. Another point, medium term, that means 2030 and onwards, a convergence and eventually a merger of the current ETS with the ETS2 should be considered. And last but not least, the timely and simultaneous implementation is crucial, as the ETS2 is an integral part of the Fit for 55 package. One should not assume that the emission reductions that the Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package aim to achieve will actually be achieved if one of the cornerstones, that is a solid carbon pricing mechanism, is actually missing or severely weakened. Just like battery electric and hydrogen-powered vehicles will not take off as long as operators cannot charge or refuel them easily, they will also not see wide adoption in the market if the conventional alternatives remain more competitive. Now, to sum it up, we see the three key factors that I mentioned that are essential to enable the decarbonization of road transport. The right vehicles, and manufacturers are clearly making the switch by investing massively to make these vehicles available and competitive. The charging and refueling infrastructure, which is largely missing today for heavy-duty vehicles, but it also obviously falls significantly short from what is needed for light-duty vehicles. And last but not least, and equally essential, is the right policy framework that helps achieve cost parity for the new powertrains. Manufacturers are doing everything they can to close the TCO gap, but despite technology improvements and cost reductions that can be expected, this will not be enough without a proper carbon pricing scheme in place. We need an ambitious carbon price that gradually increases to significantly higher levels than today to drive the deployment of zero-emission vehicles. And we need targeted regulations such as the Renewable Energy Directive to ensure that the green energy and fuels become available. They will help cutting the emissions from the old and the new fleet in the transition to climate neutrality. Now, with that being said, we encourage everyone to now do what is necessary to ensure that the ETS for road transport is established. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Thomas. That's a clear message in support of carbon pricing for the road transport sector. It's also a clear message that from your perspective, this is not a silver bullet and this is not intended as replacing other regulatory instruments. I think especially given the complex task and the challenge to decarbonize the transport sector in a timely manner. We'll move to the next speaker, Ms. Sophie Defour from Transport and Environment, giving us a perspective from an umbrella organization for NGOs, so coming from civil society. Sophie, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks a lot, Sam. Well, we at Transport and Environment believe that the ETS2 is an essential part of the Fit for 55 package to reach the 2030 climate targets and also to generate the revenues that we need to do investments that can help the lowest incomes to also take part in the transition. We do have some suggestions for safeguards in terms of price control and also the distributive impacts that we would like to see implemented in the ETS2 and also in the Social Climate Fund proposals. So I have a couple of slides to lay those out for you. Basically, we have 3 price control safeguards, one of which is increased regulatory ambition, another is requiring the fuel suppliers to absorb part of the ETS2 price, and then finally introducing a price ceiling or price corridor. And I'll go into each of those in a minute. And then on the distributive impacts safeguard side, there we think that actually the ETS2 has a progressive potential if there's full revenue recycling of the ETS2, that if the Social Climate Fund is targeted and excludes fossil fuel projects, that this can really be a transformative fund to help the lowest incomes to take part in the transition. And finally, that we can start the Social Climate Fund a bit earlier by front-loading the ETS2 revenues. So in terms of our price control safeguards, we think it's essential to increase the regulatory ambition in the Fit for 55 package beyond what the Commission has proposed in July. I think we live today in a different world than we did past summer. We're now trying to get the EU independence of Russian fossil fuels. There's also been economic and technological developments. So we feel that the Fit for 55 package falls a bit behind what is possible. And so we see that if you would take the ETS2 out of the policy package, that then in fact, you wouldn't reach the emissions target for road transport and buildings, which is set at -43%. You would fall short of about 8 to 10% of that emissions target. But we also see that ETS2 prices are quite high and a lot higher than they would be if you increase ambition on the regulatory sides. So if you increase ambition in car CO2 standards and in the EPBD, then actually ETS2 prices could be 80% lower in 2030, which we think could help a lot towards making the scheme both more socially and more politically acceptable. Our second safeguard is to require the oil majors to absorb part of the ETS2 price. So while citizens obviously pollute when they drive their cars and when they heat their homes, they're not the biggest polluters, and they certainly don't have the most tools at hand to change their fuels in short term. While oil majors, on the other hand, so the fuel suppliers, they have not taken responsibility over the past decades. They've known about climate change and have been lobbying against measures to tackle it for many, many years, and they haven't been paying their fair share of taxes. So we think the ETS2 is actually an opportunity to restore a bit the balance between who pays for the transition within society, and to make sure that also the biggest polluters contribute to that. So what we would propose is that the ETS2 has a price setting transparency mechanism where fuel suppliers are obliged to provide a breakdown of the different cost elements that go into their retail prices to the EU. So how much of it is extraction, how much is refinery, how much is profit. This is something that's already required by the EU for agriculture products, and also at national level, this is something that's now being implemented to track the windfall profits, like for example in Italy. And then what the EU would do is they would put a legal limit on how much of the cost of the ETS2 can be passed on by the fuel suppliers to the end consumers. So how much can they put in the prices at the pump versus how much should be absorbed. And here we propose that the cost is split 50-50 between the fuel suppliers and the end consumers, and that the EU, based on that price setting transparency, monitors this cost pass-through to make sure that it's in line with the legal limits. If fuel suppliers go above the legal limits, then they should pay a fine into the Social Climate Fund, which can then be used to help the lowest incomes transition away from fossil fuels. Our third proposal for a price control in the ETS2 is to introduce a price ceiling or a price corridor. So there's been different studies over the past couple of months which have shown that the ETS2 can have a progressive effect if you have good revenues recycling. And I won't go into details of all the studies. I'll just show here some results from modeling that the European Commission did last month, which shows that if you use the Social Climate Fund endowments of the member states, plus their national co-financing requirements to the Social Climate Fund, that then actually all member states are able to compensate the poorest 20% of households in their country for the impacts of the ETS2. And not only compensate, they can actually create a progressive income effect for these households. Low and middle income member states would even be able to compensate 40% of households, and low income member states would be able to compensate the 60% lowest households. So clearly, if you spend revenues well, you can mitigate the potential regressive impacts and actually translate it into a progressive income effects. However, what we see is that if you have very high CO2 prices, so if the price of the ETS2 would be more around 100 euros rather than around 50 euros per ton CO2, that then what are net welfare gains under lower prices for middle incomes become small regressive impacts. So income deciles 4 to 6 could actually experience regressive impacts then. And these would not be the primary targets for the Social Climate Fund investments. So it would be hard to compensate these households for the very high prices. So that's why we're proposing a price ceiling that can help shield those lower middle income households, and at the same time can help member states to plan their compensation measures. Now, we did some analysis into how high such a price ceiling should then be. And what we found was that if you would have a price ceiling of 50 euros per ton CO2 in 2026, and that price ceiling would increase by between 5 and 10 euros per ton CO2 annually, that you could still deliver on the emissions budgets. Now, this is a price assuming the current regulatory ambition of the Fit for 55 package. As you might remember on my first slide, I said that our main ask is also to increase the regulatory ambition, which could again help with this price ceiling as well. In terms of distributive impact safeguards, here we have the following proposals. So we would like for all of the ETS2 revenues to be used for social climate action in buildings and road transports. That means that none of the ETS2 revenues should go to the innovation fund, which is not targeted towards a certain sector and where we think that the money would not end up with these two sectors, and certainly not for projects that enhance the social goals. We think also all of the spendings should be reported under the social climate plans. So as in the Commission's proposal, that's only the projects that are funded through the social climate funds, but we think that the EU should be able to give member states guidance on what they do with all of the ETS2 revenues. A second point here is that we think the social climate fund size should be linked to the ETS2 price. So if the ETS2 price is higher than foreseen, then also the social climate fund should increase in size to make sure that we can mitigate the social impacts. We would also like to see a bigger social climate fund compared to what the Commission has proposed by having a top up from the ETS1. Actually, today, already 30% of buildings emissions are covered by the ETS1, with district heating being included in that system. And also electricity generation is included in the ETS1, which, as we're seeing today, also has impacts on consumer household bills. So we think some revenues going to the social climate funds from the ETS1 would help mitigate some of the social impacts. We also want the social climate fund to be more targeted. So in the Parliament, there's currently discussions on including SMEs in the scope of the social climate funds. We think this is a very big sector, and we should really make sure that this limited amount of money is spent to those who are the most vulnerable, which we think are vulnerable households and micro enterprises. And we should ensure that none of the money from the Social Climate Fund is going to fossil fuel projects. So that means also no support for low emission transport, but only for zero emission transports. And finally, we think that the Social Climate Fund should start a couple of years before the ETS2 price kicks in, so that we can already get started with these investments. We think that can quite easily be done by front loading the revenues that we know will come in a couple of years. And already starting investments with that pot of money. So this in terms of the safeguards that we're proposing. I would just like to make one more point, and that's on another proposal that's being floated in the European Parliament or discussed in the European Parliament, which is to limit the scope of the ETS2 to only commercial buildings and commercial vehicles. Now, on the vehicle side, we looked into what that would mean in terms of emissions coverage of the scheme. So what you can see in this table here is on the left-hand side, a full scope ETS, which would cover all vehicles. Obviously, that's 100% of road transport emissions. If you then limit it to commercial vehicles only, in theory, that would mean trucks, vans, buses, and corporate fleets, and then you would cover 52% of the road transport emissions. But actually, in practice, there's no way to do that because you cannot differentiate at the fuel station between these different categories of vehicles. So in practice, this would come down to a scope of heavy-duty vehicles only, which would limit the emissions coverage of the ETS2 to only 23% of road transport emissions. As Thomas said before, if you delay the introduction of the ETS2, or if you reduce the scope significantly, obviously that has impacts on the 2030 targets and on our ability to reach that. So we would caution against this and rather look at the compensation sides. And here I share again our distributive impact safeguards that we're proposing. Look at the compensation side to shield vulnerable households from the ETS2 price, while making sure that wealthier households who can really carry the carbon price burden start paying as well. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophie, for that clear overview, not only presenting some facts and figures, but also to explain how this can work for people and the climate. You mentioned in detail the need to have a proper look at price control aspects and redistribution of the revenues. I'll move to Mr. Liese next. Mr. Liese, as far as I've been listening carefully, I did not hear any fundamental opposition against this idea yet. So I assume this makes you rather pleased as a policymaker in charge of this file. But I'm sure there are some other political concerns you have to balance at this stage with broader economic, social, but also environmental necessities. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you to everybody. You can start the slides maybe in 2 minutes. So I would just say a few words in the beginning. So again, thank you to everybody in this panel. And in fact, I'm working with many of you for many years on carbon pricing. And whenever we see IPCC reports, speeches of the Secretary General of the United Nations, the message is clear. Without carbon pricing, we cannot achieve ambitious targets. I have worked a lot with the Potsdam Institute, with T&E and many others on my report, and I'm very grateful for the contributions. And if you allow me, I'm also very grateful for ACEA, because a long time ACEA opposed any command control measures, and they said we should just have an ETS. And that's maybe one reason for the problem that we are facing now, that some people think the ETS2 is just to get a free ride for automotive industry. It is not. We want a policy mix, all of us, and I think the message is clear. But unfortunately, yeah, there's a lot of resistance. You know, there's a lot of common sense, and I think clear messages here in this panel. But in the parliament, even more than in the member states, there is a lot of opposition against ETS2. Here in the council, it's mainly Hungary and Poland that are against. But Kaczynski and Orban have a lot of allies in the European Parliament, and not only the usual suspects. So it's official position still of the Green Group and the Social Democratic Group to kill the ETS2. So the patient is in intensive care unit. As you know, I'm a doctor, and I also work on health. So this is really serious. But I'm determined to save the life of a patient, because I'm sure it would have many, many negative consequences if we kill the ETS2. One point was mentioned by Jonathan Todd, the director of T&E. If we kill a very important element of the Fit for 55 package, the world would look at us and say, if Europe cannot do it, how can we even dare to try? It will also create problems in member states that want to introduce a carbon price. They will all say, oh, Europe didn't manage, why should we do? And I'm quite convinced that we cannot achieve our ambitious 2030 target without the carbon price also in this area. And now I would like to show you some slides. So this is one example. Of course, you can always have different interpretation, but I think the slide is quite clear. Since ETS1, and a lot of us, Sam was with those, fight it to have a real ambitious ETS1. We had a very low carbon price in 2012, But then we managed to get the MSR and to get a more ambitious ETS, and emissions in the energy sector went down significantly. In transport, they went up. So there is something to be done. Next slide, please. Many people argue you can do it by command and control. So why to have a carbon price if we can do it by command and control? Some weeks ago, the Minister for Environment from Norway was in Brussels, and he explained to me, to my surprise, that in Norway, they think they need a carbon price for the transport. They have more than 50% electric vehicles on the street. It's not a target for new cars. They have them on the street. But for the rest of the 50%, they think they need the carbon price because otherwise they will not be able to decarbonize this other 50%. Germany has 3.7%. The Netherlands have a little bit more, but all the other member states are sometimes even less advanced than Germany. So if Norway thinks they cannot do it without the carbon price, who in Europe really has a plan to do it without the carbon price? Next slide. This is the figures from Germany, but you can copy paste them for about 10 European countries that have a similar effort sharing target. So those member states that have an effort sharing target about 50% or slightly lower, they need to decarbonize the transport sector significantly. On the left column, you see the target for the decarbonization of the German transport sector. And the right column is what Jan Huitema, the rapporteur for CO2 cars, put on the table. And it's no secret that it is not yet a majority position in the parliament and will probably never be the position of the council. So maybe there is a bit less ambition, but let's assume Huitema will succeed. We still have a gap of 2/3 of the transport emissions. So, and when people say, let's do by command and control, we have to see that command and control measures that we did until now only cover new cars. So the question is, are we going to decarbonize existing cars with command and control measures? What would that mean? Will we tell people individually, you are not allowed to use your car? Or today you go by bicycle, please, and maybe tomorrow you can use your car. So these are individual choices. And I think we need to have a system where everybody on an individual base takes a decision to reduce CO2, and those that do it are rewarded. And this can be done with the carbon price, but not with command and control. Next slide. Why not to do national solutions? Because the European solution reduces costs. Of course, we want to have an efficient climate policy and not have more costs than necessary. And that a common approach is good for the costs has been confirmed by the British ambassador who came to my office recently and said, you know, on a technical level, we are in favor of linking our ETS in the UK with the EU ETS because we know it will be more cost efficient. So the British understand that European action is needed. How can a European Parliament say we want national action here? I think it's not convincing. Next slide. Mr. Edenhofer mentioned this point. I will just reiterate. Command and control come also with the cost, but there is no revenues. With the ETS, we have a revenue, and that is key to make it really possible for the low-income families. Next slide. ETS 1 promotes renewable energy and energy efficiency, and that's good. But some of those that are now arguing ETS 1 should be more ambitious and ETS 2 should not happen at all, they seem to forget that ETS 1 also promotes nuclear energy. I can understand if this is a French position, but if it's a green position or a social democratic position, to have the ETS1 much more ambitious, you promote nuclear. So don't forget this. And the ETS2 doesn't promote nuclear. It promotes insulation, heat pumps, electric vehicles, public transport, something that normally the Greens and the Social Democrats really like. Next point. Yeah, and that's very important in these times of crisis. The ETS1 exists already. So when we increase ambition here, more than the Commission proposed, we will immediately have higher electricity prices. And I saw the slides of Professor Edenhofer. This is, of course, to be taken into account. We need the decarbonization of our economy. And if people buy electric vehicles or heat pumps now, and the electricity prices will go up, also because of very ambitious ETS1, we may incentivize what we don't want to incentivize, because people will see rising electricity prices. The decarbonization will not be next year. Also here, time is needed. And then they are discouraged to buy heat pumps or electric vehicles. The ETS2 will kick in only in a few years. My latest proposal, and that will be my last slide, is to keep the Commission proposal 2026. So we have more than 3 years to prepare. And that's an important difference. So when we speak about the current crisis, ETS1 has a potential, if we do it wrong, to make the current crisis worse. In the long term, both systems are necessary to achieve our climate target. But in short term, the ETS is existing is a bigger challenge, because every political decision will immediately be reflected in the carbon price. Next slide. There is a prejudice that ETS1 can't be ambitious enough because it hits the big industry and they can afford it. And ETS2 is hitting the poor. That's why we shouldn't do it. But first of all, ETS1 does not only affect industry, but also electricity consumers. Poor people in Bulgaria and Romania has an effect here, and the income is lower. That's why the effect is bigger than in other parts of Europe. And the ETS2, of course, doesn't hit only the poor. It hit also, and as they consume, we all know this, that the rich people consume more energy. They pollute more because they have big ships, big houses, big cars. And I think the challenge is to target them and to help those in need, but not to say we don't do anything about these sectors, because then we would also give the rich people a free ride. And I don't think that is also socially the right thing. Next point. Yeah, that's a very specific part. According to the Commission proposal in the ETS Maritime, which I support very much, there is a problem also. So we need to include maritime emissions, but according to the Commission proposals, all ships smaller than 5,000 gross tons are excluded for administrative reason. We are discussing to go down step by step, and there are amendments for lower figure, but especially the left ship, which is for me quite a big one, will not be covered. So in ETS2, we could cover those. And also that, I think, is a question of fairness to have them covered. Rich people that have big boats shouldn't get a free ride. Last point. Yeah, I worked a lot on a compromise, and I can keep it short because it's quite similar to what T&E put on the table. And I find it challenging that I, as an EPP member and rapporteur, put something on the table that is developed by an NGO, and still Social Democrats and Greens are not ready to support it. So we have a real hard time here. But I agree that the Social Climate Fund should be much stronger linked with the ETS2, that we have a front loading. I think 2 years is realistic, can be done. I suggest a price cap. And on top of that, Potsdam Institute made a very good proposal of a warning price. So if the price achieves at a specific level, I suggest 45 euro. The policymakers in the member states and in the European Union should act and reduce the demand by supporting people and if necessary also by command and control measures to reduce the emissions. I have included the idea of a cost pass limit for the producers of oil and gas, and Sophie explained it quite well. And I've also made the proposal to include the luxury ships and the process heating. Professor Edenhofer may also elaborate on this. So we had a first discussion on this compromise proposal yesterday. We are not yet there, so people are raising questions, and not many colleagues are doing concrete proposals and saying, where is the solution? So please, everybody around who has been a little bit impressed about the arguments of Sophie, Professor Edenhofer, and the others, reach out to your MEPs. Also in my group, I would, of course, benefit from some support, but especially S&D, Greens, and Renew, they need some motivation to work on this and to find solution. The left is probably a hopeless case. They are against the market and will vote against the ETS anyhow. But these other groups, I think it would be a shame if European Parliament kills this proposal and aligns with Orban and Kaczynski in climate policy. I hope we can avoid this. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Liese, for outlining here some of the major political hurdles you're still facing, but also actively working on debunking some of the misunderstandings as you see them. Whatever happens with these discussions, I think it is fair to say that with the information we see here and the compromises being openly presented, these discussions are not so much behind closed doors and in dark corners of the parliament, but it's very much part of the democratic discussions going forward. So we'll move into the full panel discussion next. I hope the panelists will allow me to maybe go over time by about 10 minutes, if that's okay, because otherwise we need to cut this short. I see thumbs up, so thank you very much for that. We are joined, and I'll give the floor to you first by Ms. Nicolette van der Jacht. You joined a bit later, but I introduced you duly in the beginning of the session. So you're Director General of the European Organization of Logistics Service Providers and Freight Forwarders. I'm happy to draw on your perspective first, as you haven't presented anything yet, just to give your take on some of the inputs you've heard earlier, and then I'll open it up to the whole group to have a further discussion on this.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on your panel. Indeed, as you said, I'm coming from the Freight Forwarders Association, representing here the freight, but also maybe the customer. The freight forwarders are not asset owners; they work for the shippers, their clients, and for shippers' clients, they want to know more and more carbon emissions of their freight. They want to have sort of the measurements. They want to reductions there. Everybody sort of, and that's why, as Clicker, we also very much support the ambitions to further carbon reductions and sort of also the European Commission's ambitions here. From that perspective, we do believe we've been supportive to the market-based measures to reduce emissions in the transport sector. Freight forwarders, they use all modes of transport. They use maritime, they use rail and road. Of course, what we see today and what we will, I think, continue to see is that, well, freight transport will continue to rely very much on road transport. There's been a lot of ambitions to have modal shift, to move more to road freight to rail transport and other modes. But the reality, of course, is with the increase of freight. And that's what we also see in other elements of the Fit for 55 proposals, is that transport will definitely grow. So that also means that emissions will grow in Europe. That also means that we do have the importance to ramp up alternative powered commercial vehicles will only need to proceed more rapidly. For that reason, we also support, for example, initiatives like the European Clean Truck Association, which has the ambition to move more quickly towards zero emission vehicles. But in the meantime, of course, we need the alternative. We need alternative fuel trucks. So for us, yes, the ETS is one of the important elements. As Thomas said, it's not a single bullet. We need, it's part of the broader initiatives, which we need all. Having said that, I can understand the political difficulties now in the Parliament, also the ambition to reach and achieve a good result. As Kleka, together with shippers, we've gone out with another statement, which maybe does not align with Mr. Liese wants, but for us it's very important to have to consider the user pays and the polluter pays principles. And we believe that it's all the users have to play their role in the future ETS for road environments, and therefore it should apply equally to all road users, ranging from individual cars users to commercial freight transport. And I think that also that Sophie said that it is, in the end, it will be very difficult to split this. How can the pump differentiate between different users? For us, that is a remaining important element. And then, of course, we think it's important to boost the uptake of low and zero carbon fuels. For this, we need to have the earmarking of ETS for the in terms of the road income that needs to be invested in the uptake of low and zero emission carbon fuels. And we need the deployment of interoperable refueling. We need to have the recharging infrastructure. And for this, of course, the whole ACEA proposals is very much important. And we do support the higher ambitions here also from the Parliament. Maybe finally, we also believe that we heard that if there's not a European system, maybe member states like Finland, they consider a national system like we already have in Germany. For us and for the users, that's not very helpful. I think it's very helpful to have a single and a sole harmonized framework for the charging. And therefore, I think the a European framework and a sole we can't deal with multiple systems in Europe. So we do support a sole EU policy instrument for the charge of CO2, for the charging of the CO2 footprint. So yeah, these three elements are most important for forwarders, but I think also for shippers and for other players in the road freight transport sector. So I'll keep it here to allow us to have some further questions and debates.
Thank you very much, Nicolette, for adding your perspective, and so also from your side, clear support for applying the polluter pays principle here. I realize, Professor Edenhofer, you will have to leave at 6 o'clock, so you have a hard deadline. So I'm keen to hand back to you first. You have been listening attentively to all the stakeholder views, the presentations, the policy making perspective here. What is your take now, listening to this in terms of where could be a landing zone for this discussion, and what can be done more broadly to support finding agreement on this obviously still a thorny issue?
Yeah, thank you very much. So first of all, it is very important to understand that now we try to find a compromise. And as always, I could now start and explain why, from an economist's point of view, some of the components in the compromise are not first best, right? But I think that's a quite boring exercise. I could do this in my lectures, but not here. I would like to emphasize one important aspect here. And let me highlight two aspects. What we will lose if we lose the second emission trading scheme. First of all, we would lose fundamentally a unified European response to the climate crisis. So basically, we will lose also a regime which has a quite convincing compliance component. I don't think that the effort sharing regulation has a good compliance. I don't believe this. And this would be the simple implication that we will be pushed back into national climate policies with not a coherent framework at all. And this has two implications. The first implication is it is very unlikely that with such a system, with such a non-enforceable compliance regime, will lead us to carbon neutrality by 2050. I would say it's almost impossible. So this is number one. Second, I've tried to highlight this aspect on the geopolitical implications of the European Green Deal. The European Green Deal has the implication that we will reduce oil and gas demand even before 2030 significantly. And this has an impact, a long-term impact, and also forms expectations by all the oil and gas importers, including Russia. And it seems to me this is a very, very important aspect. And if we would basically not be in a position to negotiate the second ETS, so then even Europe cannot play a coherent role on the oil and the gas market. And it seems to me the ETS2 is a starting point that Europe plays a proactive role, and let's say this, to form a cartel on these markets. And without that, I don't think that Europe can play the role which is required in the future to play here the role which is needed purely for energy security reasons. So in that sense, I have a hard time, to be honest, to understand why the Parliament is very close to kill this proposal. And even if I would like to convey the message, even if you are not convinced about climate policy, think twice before you kill this proposal in terms of energy security.
Thank you very much. That's a very clear message here. I wonder if anybody else from the panelists want to pick up on that. Otherwise, there are a couple of questions we have in store via the Slido system as well. Michael, I see you've raised your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is to Peter Liese to better understand. So what is the current state? So is it still about arguments and finding solutions, or is it really only about defending positions? And when it is about arguments and new solutions, what do you think is most promising, or where is still room to maneuver, or which direction could one make a case or put something out that would really help to advance the debate in the right direction?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the strong statement also from Professor Edenhofer. But of course, it's clear that it is not the Parliament. It's two political groups, or three, that have formally made these amendments: the Social Democrats, Greens, and the Left. I see some development inside these groups, but it's not strong enough. Their current position is still, we want to kill it. And I have the feeling that the other political groups, ID is very clear, that is the far right, they are against. I don't see enough unity in the other groups to create a majority without these these groups. So that's very clear. There is no majority for the moment, but the parliament has not a uniform position. It's a mixture. To answer to Michael's question, there are fundamental problems. Many people, they just don't want to listen to arguments. They look at it superficial. But there are, of course, legitimate questions, and they need to be addressed. That's why I'm so grateful with the work that Sophie, for example, has done with her team and some other European and national NGOs. I think these are important. And I hope we can find a solution, including those elements. But the challenge I have is, people are also not committing to one of those elements. They say, okay, that may be helpful, but I don't know. And then we have to think twice on other issues. So there's no clear commitment. Nobody comes except myself as a rapporteur, and the second time now in the draft report and now in the compromise. Nobody else comes with a very concrete proposal and says, this is what I stand for and what I think is taking the concerns into account. So this is part of the problem. And then we have also a split, as I perceive it, between Renew on the one side and S&D and the Greens on the other side. S&D and Greens are, like T&E, asking for a bigger social climate fund. And I wouldn't exclude that, even though many colleagues in my political group don't like it. But I could imagine that we have a top-up of the social climate fund. The amount won't be huge because many people are surprised to see that ETS1 is smaller than ETS2, and we have already a lot of funds. We have the Modernization Fund, Innovation Fund, we have their own revenues for the European Union, 25%, which in ETS2 are for the Social Climate Fund, but in ETS1 are for paying back Next Generation EU. And here our budget committee is very strong. So the amount will be limited, but I'm open for such a compromise. But then I hear from Renew, this is a no-go. So Renew wants to postpone the ETS for the private sector, want to start with commercial only. And then they say we don't need a social climate fund because private people are not affected. So it's quite the opposite from Greens and S&D. And this gives me another challenge. And I think all these positions are, there are justification. I understand the Renew position and I understand the Green and S&D position to have a bigger social climate fund. But I also understand the Renew position. Some colleagues in my group share this position, no social climate fund if we don't cover private sector. But all colleagues have to move. That's the spirit of a compromise. If people use arguments to vote against, it's easy. So I can also find a lot of arguments to vote against one or other element of the Fit for 55 package. But politically, I think we cannot afford. We cannot afford to kill CO2 cars. We cannot afford to kill the effort sharing. And we cannot afford to kill the ETS and any major element when we are serious with the climate policy.
Thank you very much. I would like to zoom in a little bit on the role of the revenues, not only in terms of who bears the cost of the carbon price, but also how to reinvest them, because that obviously seems to be also part of the political discussions going forward. And of course, as we are discussing the economic considerations here, a key part of the debate we're having. And if I may, I did notice during the discussions and especially from the side of TNE, there's clear support for having also social redistribution aspects prominently on the table. From the sectoral federations, both of you did mention clearly the need to have revenues for research and development in cleaner technologies in the car sector. I wonder if we can zoom in on that a little bit more. And there is also a question in the Slido system, which was specifically addressed to Mr. Fabian. If you think, is it an either-or question, or is both a possibility? Do you think, how do you see the split of the revenues in the ETS2 going forward?
Yeah, if I may, I mean, as always, it's a compromise, and it's not black and white, which we, by the way, which is one of the reasons why we also do not think that anytime soon the ETS can be the sole instrument, because it will just, from our perspective, political reality, it's just not going to be strong enough to deliver the right signals that we need. Now, when it comes to the use of the revenues, to be honest, I have slightly more concerns, actually, without going into any numbers discussion about, of course, but slightly more concerns about the price cap that was mentioned. Of course, it's totally understandable. Sophie, you mentioned the proposal to cap the price at about 55 euros per ton. I mean, ultimately, I understand why why this proposal is being made. But in the end, it's also, again, about setting the right price signals, making sure, and in that respect, a ceiling, a cap is sort of distorting the mechanism to some extent. How the revenues, I could make my life easy and say how the revenues are being used is not so much in our focus, but that's not true. Just one point, Sam. It's not about research and development. That's not the case anymore. It's about deploying the vehicles and enabling everybody to actually avoid the higher CO2 costs by making the alternatives viable and commercially viable options. So again, we can fight long and hard about shares of revenues that are being used for certain purposes. I happily leave this to policymakers, but I'm just trying to say infrastructure is one key element that needs heavy investment to recharge and refuel the new vehicles. Transport operators need, be it private users or commercial, especially commercial transport operators, they need help to adopt the new vehicles, because they, for the foreseeable future, they will be more and remain more expensive. So, and of course, if it's political and totally understandable, politically necessary to invest large shares to mitigate the impact for the poorest households, the social effect, then so be it. Then we need to. But I agree with Professor Edenhofer here. It would be a shame if over these debates the whole system, the whole proposal would be killed.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for clarifying that. Sophie, I see your hand. I'm just keen to check whether Professor Edenhofer has any final remarks at this stage. I realize you're short on time. No, if that's not needed, then I'll move on straight to Sophie. There was also a comment clearly from ACEA also on the question: do we need a price ceiling at all? And I guess if you have a market, why not leave it to the market to decide what the price should be?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so of course, I mean, having a price ceiling makes having a second factor that determines how high the price is, apart from just the emissions cap. So it puts the emissions cap a bit at risk, which is why I think we need to think carefully about how high we set the price ceiling. However, we are talking about a system that includes both private and commercial vehicles. And while for commercial vehicles, they could carry quite a higher carbon price, and actually that would be beneficial to accelerate the deployment of zero emission trucks. For private households and for a system that's socially sensitive, I would say, I think we can benefit in the first couple of years of operation from some stability and some predictability, which a price cap could deliver. However, for commercial vehicles, there's the Eurovignette that was recently agreed to in the European Parliament, and that provides a shorter term way to already start carbon pricing for the commercial sector, and to also top up the carbon price sector signal for the commercial sector once the ETS2 starts with its operations. And we think also the Eurovignette is actually something that can generate revenues and that can be used in the next couple of years to support the deployment of zero emission trucks, because we think it's really about the next couple of years between 2022 and 2026 that will be essential to accelerate the uptake of these vehicles. And the economics show us that actually by 2026, probably it will be already more beneficial to operate a zero emission truck than a fossil fuel one. So then there would be less need on the commercial side. And then we think the priority should be towards vulnerable households for the social climate funds. And I would also like to reiterate Thomas's point that it's not about R&D. We know the solutions for road transport already, which is why we're also proposing that the money from the ETS2 should not go to the innovation fund, but rather that it's about tackling the social impacts of the transition.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I realize, Professor Edenhofer, you have to leave very soon. So I just want to take the opportunity to also express my gratitude and thank you very much for your contribution and participating, including your very clear statements on not wasting this opportunity as we have it in front of us.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Michael, I see your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I wanted to come back on your description of the current political conflict or the problem of finding compromise when one camp is insisting so much on focusing on commercial, just including commercial, and leaving the total social dimension out. So that's what I understood, versus having everyone in the system and making it a social thing, so to speak. I mean, really bringing in a strong social component. And I very much understand the intuitions, but I was wondering, and you already also made the point in your talk, we know that decarbonizing household energy use will come along with very much an increase of the use of electricity. And you already pointed out that electricity is already priced or is already under an emission trading system. So I was wondering, given that situation, so how much is there is the problem in a way solving itself, or is the argument collapsing to deliberately exclude the household sector when we know that it will happen automatically through the increased use of electricity? And would this be something to explore in terms of maybe bringing together the different positions and scopes respectively?
Thank you, Michael, for adding that specifically. We'll have to wrap up soon.
May I come in?
To give the floor to you.
I guess
yes,
the last question to me.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
So first of all, a short comment on what Sophie said. So for the moment, I think a little bit of money from ETS2 for the Innovation Fund would also be helpful if we clearly link it to the decarbonization of the building sector and the transport sector. There are innovations that still need to be implemented at large scale, but I wouldn't insist on this. If it is necessary to have a compromise, I would agree that we keep that out. The Commission has proposed it. I didn't amend it, but I'm happy if it's needed to follow your line. But it gives us another argument for the ETS2. It is often said we don't have the solutions in the building sector and in the transport sector. And what you said, Sophie, is the opposite. You said We have already the solutions. There's no R&D needed. We just need to implement. The electric vehicles exist, and also heat pumps exist, and many other solutions for the building sector, while to produce carbon neutral cement doesn't exist. So those that say ETS1 should be tougher and tougher and tougher, we have already the ambition of 61% in the Commission proposal. For the effort sharing is 40%. They ignore the technological solution. So for parts of the industry, decarbonization is science innovation and not just implementing what is already existing. In road transport and buildings, we have zero emission buildings for 10 years now, and zero emission cars also exist for a lot of time. So that's one important thing. And to Michael, I don't think it will happen automatically. So I have concrete examples that people tell me, I've bought an electric vehicles and now I see my electricity bill. Electricity prices are going up, and that discourages people to do what we want them to do, to decarbonize their private life. And that's why I think, especially in this crisis, we should reduce electricity costs. And when member states look at what they can do to address these high energy prices, we should reduce all costs that are not necessary for the electricity to give the right incentive. And I think it will not be easy. So we may do serious mistakes in the next 1 or 2 years that will discourage people from innovating and decarbonizing if they can do, but they will not be encouraged because of this high electricity prices.
Thank you very much for this.
Sam, can I just say one thing to clarify, because I think I was a bit misunderstood. What I wanted to say is that people who are suggesting we focus just on the commercial part of the sector, they are under a misconception because they think we can shield households from carbon prices. But if households use much more electricity, they are automatically priced with carbon. So I think this is the point I wanted to make. And
okay, then I fully agree. Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we're coming closer to each other. That's important at this late stage. I'm keen to wrap up soon because we have run over time already. Nicolette, I see you have your hand raised, and then I'll conclude the session if that's all right with everybody.
Thank you. Now, I just wanted to add a point there on the ring fencing, which we think, I mean, it's been questioned also, I think, in the chat. I think it's really important. Today, the cost of zero emission commercial vehicles, even they're much more expensive. They're 3.5 to 5 times more expensive than comparable conventional fueled commercial vehicles. So, and this is not going to change dramatically. That's very unlikely. So there's a need for these reinvestments. Also, R&D maybe not, but still we need better batteries. In the end, I think it needs to be go back in the sector to to make this all possible. And maybe a point to what Sophie said on the Eurovignette. It's true. Well, the Eurovignette is there, but I mean we need to be careful with the mentioning topping up of CO2 charging. It's incorporated, but I think there's also a provision if there's an ETS that needs to be reviewed. Of course, there are more charges, external costs within the Eurovignette, but I think we should avoid double charging there for CO2 emissions.
Thank you, Nicolette, for this final remarks. We have approached already the end of the session. Please allow me to conclude. And I think this discussion was very much not, do we need that CO2 price for buildings and road transport, but how can we get it done? And I think thanks to all the contributions here, it has been shown how it's necessary, but also how it's feasible, under which conditions, what parameters to improve the design of the policy instrument to make it especially environmentally, but also economically and socially an effective instrument. I hope this discussion has shown that it's not a black or white discussion in favor or against. but at least here in this virtual room, there was broad agreement that putting a carbon price for the buildings and road transport sector with smart reinvestments, redistribution, that it makes sense. I think the next step will be the 16th of May, which is the vote in the European Parliament in the Environment Committee. I think that will be the litmus test for seeing the political support that this can gather and the majorities behind this, hopefully. I wish everybody involved in these discussions fruitful exchanges, nuanced debates, and I hope we have collectively here contributed to delivering some progress. Thank you very much for all the participants joining and staying with us until the very end. And special gratitude to all the speakers who have joined, and thank you very much indeed for your excellent contributions to the debate. I look forward to continue this exchange. I do wish you all a very pleasant afternoon and evening. Thank you very much and goodbye.